How does one become more powerful than an emperor? A well-timed assassination? A coup d'etat? A decisive victory on the battlefield? No, all you gotta do is get him and his sons hitched to your daughters for a couple of generations, and the rest all falls into place like dominoes. Want the step-by-step breakdown? Well, stay tuned, because today we watch it all happen as we follow Japan's first family of schemers and strategists, the Fujiwara Clan, as they enter into the height of their golden age in the ancient imperial court. As usual though, the road to power is not gonna be without its bumps, so strap in and get ready for 2.5 centuries of political intrigue on this 9th episode of Japanese History, the Textbook, on the Byōdōin Japanese History Channel. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Japanese History, the Textbook, the series where we make our way chronologically through Japanese history using Japanese language educational sources as our guide. The specific sources I use are listed down below in the video description, and if you'd like a more thorough explanation of the concept behind this series, you can head back and check out the first few minutes of episode 1. Today's episode is the second of what's looking like it's probably going to be about a 4-part series on Japan's age of high classical antiquity, the Heian Period. Now, unlike the last couple of eras, which only spanned 1 or 2 centuries each, the Heian Period lasted for approximately 400 years, and as such it is difficult to discuss it in a nutshell. When studying the period, it is more appropriate to break it down century by century and examine it as a collection of several distinct sub-eras. The first of these, which we took a look at on our last episode, was the dawn of the Heian Period, the era in which the capital was relocated to the modern-day Kyoto area, and Emperor Kanmu and his 3 sons held a tight grip on the reins of government. The next 2 sub-eras, comprising the 9th and 10th centuries, are characterized by the rise of the northern house of the Fujiwara Clan, their elimination of their rivals, and their ultimate success in managing to become the de facto rulers of Japan for several generations. Today, we will take a look at the events of these 2 centuries. This is a particularly eventful period, so for this episode, I've decided to focus on the goings-on in and around the capital and the central government. We'll also have some serious developments going on in the provinces, especially once we get into the 10th century, but I've decided to leave those for the next episode so as to keep this one from getting out of hand lengthwise. I know there are going to be some people out there bummed out when Taira no Masakado doesn't make an appearance today, but the best I can do is promise you that we will spend ample time talking about him and all his badass 10th and 11th century Tsuwamono buddies on our next installment. 楽しみにしててください. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into it. Japanese History, the Textbook, Episode 9, The Heian Period, Part 2. When we concluded our last episode, Emperor Saga had just succeeded in preventing his older brother, the retired Emperor Heizei, from staging a coup which would have seen Saga dethroned and Heizei reinstated as emperor with the support of his ambitious mistress, Fujiwara no Kusuko. After foiling Heizei and Kusuko's plan, Saga would go on to serve as emperor for another 13 or so years before retiring in 823 and passing on the throne to his younger brother, Emperor Junna, who we also met at the end of our last episode. When Saga retired, he deliberately distanced himself from the imperial palace and avoided direct involvement in court politics, likely hoping to set the sort of behavioral example which he must have wished his older brother had followed. As a result, the power of the retired emperor as a political figure was reduced somewhat, and Japan entered into a period where, for a time, the sitting emperor's status eclipsed that of his retired forebear. Saga and Junna seem to have had a sort of unofficial agreement wherein their respective lines would inherit the throne in an alternating fashion, with Saga passing on the emperorship to Junna, Junna eventually giving it to Saga's son, Emperor Nimmyo, and Nimmyo then designating Junna's son, Prince Tsunesada, as his heir. Again, these circumstances likely arose out of a desire not to repeat the events of the retired Emperor Heizei incident, wherein imperial family members were at each other's throats over the issue of succession. However, as we see so often in history, it was not long before things began to take a turn for the unexpected. Junna and Saga passed away within 2 years of each other, 840 and 842 respectively, and in the vacuum left behind after their deaths, the delicate balance of power they had constructed quickly began to crumble as the result of an incident called the Jowa Incident, or Jowa no Hen. This incident began just before Saga's passing, as the retired emperor lay on his deathbed, when a secret letter was delivered to Saga's highest-ranking wife alleging that an aristocrat named Tomono Kawamine was plotting treason against the sitting emperor, Emperor Nimmyo. Not only that, but Kawamine was allegedly planning to set up Crown Prince Tsunesada as the figurehead around which he would organize this rebellion. This letter was quickly given over to the imperial court's Chunagon, or vice counselor of state, a man named Fujiwara no Yoshifusa, and he began to make moves to deal with the alleged traitors. Yoshifusa, by the way, was not just another random Fujiwara. I know we've met quite a lot of them at this point. Rather, he was the son of our old friend Fujiwara no Fuyutsugu of the Fujiwara clan's northern house. We became acquainted with Fuyutsugu at the end of our last episode as the close confidant of Emperor Saga, who helped the emperor triumph in the retired Emperor Heizei incident and was rewarded for his service with the position of Kurodo no To, head of the Chamberlain's office. Following the delivery of the secret letter to Yoshifusa, soldiers were dispatched to guard the imperial palace. Tomono Kawamine was arrested, and Prince Tsunesada was removed from his position as heir to the throne. He would be replaced by his younger half-brother, Prince Michiyasu, whose mother just happened to be Vice Counselor Yoshifusa's younger sister. Given this, and the fact that a number of other political rivals to Yoshifusa would end up being exiled as co-conspirators in the plot, the entire Jowa incident is often suggested to have been a setup by Yoshifusa himself. This incident is typically taught in Japanese schools as the first of several instances of the Fujiwara clan implementing Machiavellian political machinations to eliminate their rivals and advance their own power, a phenomenon known in Japanese as tashi haiseki, literally the expulsion of other clans. With the elimination of his rivals and the elevation of his nephew to crown princehood, Fujiwara no Yoshifusa's political capital only continued to rise in the imperial court, and he enjoyed a number of promotions both in office and rank. His nephew, Prince Michiyasu, would eventually become emperor in 850, ascending to the throne as Emperor Montoku, and under the new administration, Yoshifusa found himself promoted to the position of Daijo Daijin, or Chancellor of the Realm, the highest office in the imperial government. He arranged to have his daughter, Akira Keiko, married to Emperor Montoku, and when the union produced a son, Yoshifusa had the infant boy proclaimed crown prince, despite the existence of several older half-brothers. Conveniently for Yoshifusa, Emperor Montoku would die suddenly of disease less than a decade later, and the young crown prince would ascend to the imperial throne at the tender age of 9 as the Emperor Seiwa. As we discussed a number of episodes ago, raising children to the post of emperor was an act generally avoided during the first few centuries of Japan's monarchy. But with the ascension of the young Emperor Seiwa, it would begin to become a trend. Yoshifusa knew that the young boy would not actually be able to manage the affairs of state, and that he, as the boy's grandfather, would be able to act as the de facto ruler of the empire. Further securing Yoshifusa's foothold was the fact that Seiwa had literally grown up at his own villa, as it was customary in this era for imperial children to be raised in the households of their mothers' families. In this way, Yoshifusa became the unofficial regent of Japan, ruling the country on behalf of his grade school-aged grandson. However, this unofficialness meant that he was still, to some small extent, vulnerable to the machinations of his rivals, and he would need to cook up some kind of further scheme in order to make his position truly unassailable. The Otenmon incident of 866 would give him exactly this opportunity. This incident actually began as a political conflict completely unrelated to the Fujiwara themselves, being the culmination of a power struggle between another powerful member of the Tomo clan, the Grand Counselor of State Tomono Yoshio, and the current Minister of the Left, one Minamoto no Makoto. Minamoto, by the way, was one of several clan names given to extraneous members of the imperial bloodline, who were reduced from the status of royalty to the status of nobility, typically so that the court didn't need to waste money paying them the royal stipend that any prince or princess was entitled to. One particular line of descendancy from one of these Minamoto individuals would go on to become the premier bloodline of Japan's medieval samurai, a topic which we will discuss more in our next video. But the aforementioned Minamoto no Makoto was not of this line. He was simply a son of the late Emperor Saga, who had been reduced to nobility and was participating in the government as a high-ranking bureaucrat. Anyway, the Otenmon incident began when, in the third month of 866, someone set fire to the Daidai's Otenmon Gate, a gate which served as the entrance to the Chōdōin, a portion of the imperial palace complex where important ceremonies, banquets, and various affairs of government were carried out. In the immediate aftermath, Tomo no Yoshio alleged that the arson had been the work of Minamoto no Makoto, and he attempted to have his rival punished for the crime. Things initially seemed poised to work out in Yoshio's favor, but then suddenly, Fujiwara no Yoshifusa stepped in on behalf of Makoto and put the brakes on Yoshio's scheme. Shortly thereafter, a witness came forward, professing that it was in fact Yoshio's own son who had set fire to the gate, likely at the orders of his father, and this testimony was soon backed up by Yoshio's household steward, who corroborated the witness's account after being tortured. As punishment, Yoshio, his son, and a substantial number of other members of the Tomo and Ki clans were exiled off to various provinces in Japan's more remote corners, a blow from which the Tomo clan would never really recover. As a complex and nuanced mystery case that occurred nearly 1,200 years ago, the real truth of the Otenmon incident will probably forever remain lost in the sands of time. But whether Tomo no Yoshio was really guilty or not, it is clear that Fujiwara no Yoshifusa took advantage of the incident to eliminate Yoshio and advance his own power. So, what exactly did Yoshifusa have to gain from all this? For the man who was already serving as Daijo Daijin, what was the point of getting rid of these slightly lower-ranking Tomo and Ki clan aristocrats? Well, as we discussed a moment ago, Yoshifusa had been acting as the de facto ruler of Japan since his grandson Seiwa's ascension to the throne. Such a position was technically referred to as Sessho, a title given to a regent acting in place of either a child or a female emperor. You may recall that this is the position that Prince Shotoku allegedly occupied when he managed Japan's affairs on behalf of his aunt, Empress Suiko, back in the Asuka period. Prince Shotoku, however, was an imperial family member, and up until this point, the office of Sessho had been defined as a position which only an individual of imperial blood could occupy. Yoshifusa wished to be officially appointed to this position, but with formidable rivals such as Tomo no Yoshio still holding significant power in the central government, he knew that such a revolutionary appointment would be difficult to bring to fruition. With the removal of Yoshio and many of his allies in the aftermath of the Otenmon incident, Yoshifusa's road to the top was finally free of obstructions. Just a few months after Yoshio's guilt in the incident was decided, Fujiwara no Yoshifusa was officially appointed Sessho by Emperor Seiwa, marking the first instance in Japanese history of a non-royal being allowed to rule the realm. This trend would only continue with Yoshifusa's successor, his adopted son Fujiwara no Mototsune, who became the next leader of the northern Fujiwara after Yoshifusa's death. Mototsune became the next Sessho regent when Emperor Seiwa was succeeded by his young son, Emperor Yose, who was in turn Mototsune's nephew, but the relationship between the two soured as Yose grew older, and Mototsune eventually pressured the young ruler into retiring from the office of emperor. Mototsune then arranged the accession of the next sovereign, Emperor Kokufū, who, being 55 years of age and well outside the line of succession, was probably as surprised as anyone to find himself suddenly sitting on the imperial throne. Emperor Kokufū thoroughly owed his new status to Mototsune, and so he made him his de facto regent as a show of gratitude. This differed slightly from the aforementioned Sessho position, however, as you will recall that was a post that specifically referred to regents governing in the place of women or children. Emperor Kokufū would pass away just 3 years later in 887, and his son and successor, the 21-year-old Emperor Uda, would finally give Fujiwara no Mototsune an official name for his position, Kanpaku. The term Kanpaku was, like so much else, based on an ancient Chinese precedent, and it designated an individual who was permitted to be involved in and to speak in regards to all things. And from here, it would designate a regent who governed on behalf of a full-grown male emperor. Along with Sessho, the position is an extremely important one in Japanese history, and if you remember anything about Mototsune, it should be that he was the person with whom the post originated. One might expect Mototsune to be grateful to Emperor Uda for this supremely honorable appointment, but this is the Fujiwara we are dealing with here, and barely a moment had lapsed before a somewhat ridiculous conflict known as the Akio incident broke out between the two. After being appointed Kanpaku, Mototsune followed court tradition for such a high-level appointment by immediately resigning from the post and then awaiting a second decree from the emperor reappointing him to the position. However, in this second decree, the emperor and his Tachibana clan advisor who drew up the document chose to use the title of Akio rather than Kanpaku. This too was a post derived from Chinese history, and Emperor Uda and his advisor seemed to have conceptualized it as basically being the same as Kanpaku. But Mototsune, ever the know-it-all, pointed out to the emperor that in China, Akio was a title which consisted of a very high rank but no actual job duties. Mototsune chose to take offense at this and thus follow his new title to a T, completely retiring from the imperial court and refusing to govern the country at all. Given that Mototsune had been the top guy in the central government for more than a decade at this point, his sudden absence caused Japan's entire government apparatus to screech to a halt, and Emperor Uda and his other advisors were forced to frantically scramble to rectify the situation. Mototsune demanded the punishment of the Tachibana advisor who had drawn up the offending decree, perhaps his ulterior motive in creating the whole commotion. And Emperor Uda seemed ready to oblige him until a high-ranking young scholar named Sugawara no Michizane stepped in to smooth over the situation. Michizane, who was at the time serving as the governor of Sanuki province, authored a strongly worded letter to Mototsune, which convinced him to calm his anger and accept the emperor's apology without calling for the punishment of any parties involved. With this, the Akio incident was brought to a peaceful conclusion, but the whole affair allowed Mototsune to prove to the emperor and to his fellow politicians that he and he alone was the central core around which Japan's government revolved. While Mototsune's behavior in this incident may have succeeded in further strengthening the Fujiwara clan's authority and presence in the imperial court, it apparently left a bit of a bad taste in Emperor Uda's mouth, and when Mototsune passed away in 891, Uda chose not to appoint a new Kanpaku regent in his place. Rather, he would take the reins of government himself, a style of government known in the world of Japanese history as Tenno Shinsei. Technically, several other emperors in the past had also served as the actual leaders of their respective regimes, but we see the term Tenno Shinsei used more in history books from this point on, as we now have the Fujiwara regent style of government to compare and contrast it with. The Fujiwara regent system, by the way, is referred to as Sekkan Seiji, with the word Sekkan just being a combination of the two regental titles, Sessho and Kanpaku, and the word Seiji meaning politics or governing. Now, this does not mean that Emperor Uda was doing everything completely solo. And indeed, his two main advisors during his regime were Mototsune's son, Fujiwara no Tokihira, and the aforementioned hero of the Akio incident, Sugawara no Michizane. Uda appointed Michizane head of the Chamberlain's office, and in general relied on him as his closest confidant. In 894, Emperor Uda decided that it was high time that another Kentoshi embassy be sent to Tang, China. It had been 56 years since the last one, and he settled on his right-hand man Michizane to lead the endeavor. It is thought that this selection of Michizane was prompted by the persuasion of a jealous Fujiwara no Tokihira, who knew that if Michizane was chosen to lead the embassy, he would end up being absent from the imperial court for several years, or even permanently if the embassy were to meet with a disaster at sea, as was so common with the Kentoshi voyages. Michizane was no fool, however, and he responded to the situation not by protesting his own appointment, but rather by suggesting that the entire idea of sending an embassy at all was a mistake. Ever the well-informed academic, Michizane argued to the emperor that Tang China was in a state of political instability, and that not only would sending an embassy be unnecessarily risky, but that there was no longer even anything to learn from the Tang Chinese. He was not really bluffing here, by the way, as the Tang dynasty did indeed collapse just 13 years later in 907. Anyway, the emperor accepted the opinion of his favored advisor, and in that year, 894, the practice of sending Kentoshi embassies to Tang China was permanently abolished. While this abolition would have the immediate effect of saving Sugawara no Michizane's political skin, it would also have significant long-term ramifications in that it led to the decline of Chinese cultural influence on Japan, and the rise of a truly unique Japanese culture which includes many of the cultural elements still associated with the country today. The political world of Heian Japan was an ever-turbulent one, and while Michizane had bought himself some temporary safety, his rivals, particularly Fujiwara no Tokihira, had hardly given up on attempting to knock him down a few pegs. In 897, despite being only 31 years of age, Emperor Uda retired from the emperorship and passed on the throne to his 12-year-old son, who took the regnal name of Emperor Daigo. Uda's intent here was almost certainly to continue ruling from behind the scenes, a trend that we will see really become set in stone in the next couple of centuries. However, it is important to note that this was not yet an established practice, and Uda by no means had total control over his son's regime, a fact which will become very important in a moment. Under the regime of Emperor Daigo, Sugawara no Michizane and Fujiwara no Tokihira maintained their places at the summit of the imperial bureaucracy, serving, respectively, in the positions of Minister of the Right and Minister of the Left. Michizane, however, continued to be a target of jealousy from his peers due to all the preferential treatment he had received from ex-Emperor Uda, and in 901, Tokihira managed to convince the new Emperor Daigo that Michizane was plotting against him. Daigo, now 16, likely saw Michizane as a tool for his retired father Uda to continue meddling in the affairs of government, and thus was probably all too eager to gain a pretext to expel him from the court. The retired Uda is said to have rushed to aid his old friend when he heard the news, but was barred from entering the imperial palace by the palace guards. Again, this was not yet the age when retired emperors could rule the court with an iron fist. Sugawara no Michizane was exiled to the Dazaifu in Kyushu. Technically, he was transferred there to serve as the Dazai Gon no Sochi, the number 2 in charge of the Dazaifu, but for all intents and purposes, he had been exiled. This incident, by the way, is known as the Shotai incident, or the Shotai no Hen. Michizane would die of disease just 2 years later, in 903. And shortly thereafter, a number of sudden deaths within the imperial family and the Fujiwara clan, as well as a case of lightning striking the imperial palace, led many of his contemporaries to believe that he had returned from the grave as an angry spirit to curse those who had wronged him. However, as the years and centuries went by, Michizane evolved to become revered as the god of academics, and he is enshrined as such in the numerous Tenmangu shrines throughout Japan, where students studying for entrance exams and such continue to pray to him even today. All in all, he is a figure very popular in Japanese folklore and literature, and of all the characters who we have seen in this video thus far, he is probably one of, if not the most common subjects of visual representation in Japanese artwork throughout the centuries. Despite the successful removal of Sugawara no Michizane, Fujiwara no Tokihira would never end up being elevated to the status of regent, as the young Emperor Daigo, like his father Uda before him, opted to pursue the Tenno Shinsei style of government and rule Japan himself. Emperor Daigo's regime is remembered to history as the Engi no Chi, with Engi being the name of the era comprising the majority of Daigo's reign. This regime would go on to be celebrated and even pedestalized by later generations as a shining example of Japan's imperial government in its most ideal form, with a strong emperor ruling at its center and great efforts being made to repair and revitalize the ever-crumbling Ritsuryo system of governance. If you've been watching this series for any length of time, you've probably noticed the trend that someone always seems to be working hard to fix the Ritsuryo system. And looking back in hindsight, it seems that perhaps it was always doomed to fail from the start. Even with Emperor Kanmu's policy reforms at the dawn of the Heian period, the system had continued to deteriorate, and Emperor Daigo would make a last-ditch effort to save it from its inevitable doom. He issued the Engi no Shōen Seirire, an order consolidating Japan's various privately held Shōen estates, which also included instructions to once again carry out a reallotment of the country's rice fields to its peasant cultivators. This would end up being the final such redistribution, and most Japanese history books seem to be in agreement that, following the reigns of Emperor Daigo and his son Emperor Murakami, the Ritsuryo system finally collapsed for good. It would continue to exist in name for many more centuries as Japan's on-paper system of government, but in practice it had fundamentally ceased to function. From here on, Japan's tax system would come to be based on its land rather than its people, and affairs in the provinces would come to be almost completely entrusted to the various provinces' kokushi, or provincial governors, with very little meddling from either their superiors in the imperial court or the district managers serving under them. This will come to be an important point in explaining the emergence of the samurai, and we will explore it in further depth in our next episode. The next few generations would see some slight ebb and flow in the power of the Fujiwara clan, as they struggled, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, to maintain their grip on Japan's regency. Emperor Daigo's immediate successor, Emperor Suzaku, would appoint a Fujiwara, Tokihira's younger brother Fujiwara no Tadahira, to be his regent, but Emperor Suzaku's successor, the aforementioned Emperor Murakami, quickly pivoted back to the Tenno Shinsei system of emperor-centric government. Following Emperor Murakami's death, the next emperor, Emperor Reizei, once again appointed a Fujiwara to serve as his regent, but some resistance to this practice still remained in the court. One Minamoto no Takaakira, son of the late Emperor Daigo and another non-warrior recipient of the Minamoto name, made a bid at supplanting the Fujiwara as the main power behind the throne. His son-in-law was an imperial prince, and one of the main candidates to become the weak and sickly Emperor Reizei's crown prince and successor. And, as we saw with the Fujiwara, becoming an emperor's father-in-law was about the surest path to power that one could hope for in ancient Japan. However, before Takaakira could see his ambitions realized, he found himself suddenly accused of plotting rebellion against Emperor Reizei, and he was swiftly exiled off to Kyushu in an episode remembered as the Anna incident, or the Anna no Hen. The accusation levied against him was likely the product of more Machiavellian scheming by the Fujiwara, and following the Anna incident, the regent positions of Sessho and Kanpaku became permanent posts in the imperial court, which, with the exception of a brief blip at the end of the 16th century, would go on to be monopolized by the Fujiwara for the next 900 years. With their securement of the top spot in Japan's political world, the Fujiwara found themselves mostly free of external threats. Instead, the next wave of instability would come from within, as the Northern House began to tear itself apart with internal rivalry. Various contenders within the family vied to be next in line to become the Uji no Choja, the patriarch and leader of the clan, and brothers fought brothers in the struggle to reach this summit of power. When the dust had settled in the early 11th century, the one finally left as the undisputed leader of the Fujiwara clan was a man named Fujiwara no Michinaga. And if there were a contest for the Fujiwara family member most well known to the average person today, this is the guy you'd probably want to put your money on. Throughout his lifetime, Michinaga would manage to have 4 of his daughters married to 4 different emperors and spend roughly 30 years ruling Japan from behind the scenes as either the father-in-law or the paternal grandfather of multiple emperors. Before you have to ask, yes, this produced an extremely inbred family situation, with 2 of Michinaga's daughters marrying their own nephews in order to become empress consorts. But as we have seen before, this was hardly uncommon in ancient Japan's aristocracy, nor that of many other countries for that matter. At the celebration for his 3rd daughter's wedding, Michinaga had his own personal Scarface moment when he famously read his full moon poem, known in Japanese as the Mochizuki no Uta, triumphantly proclaiming,
この世は我が世とぞ思う望月のかけたることもなしと思えば
No waning in the glory of the full moon. This world is indeed my world. The poem is extremely famous in Japan as a symbol of the Fujiwara clan's power at their apex, though some interpret a hint of melancholy in it, as Michinaga was struggling with illness at the time that he recited it, and was perhaps hinting that his glory, just like the fullness of the moon in the sky, was inevitably a transient thing. Michinaga would be succeeded as the Uji no Choja of the northern Fujiwara by his eldest son, Fujiwara no Yorimichi, who would serve as regent and de facto ruler of Japan for a stunning span of 50 years. Yorimichi also married his daughters to emperors, but the unions failed to produce any heirs, and so while the era of Yorimichi and his father Michinaga is regarded by most historians as the apex of the northern Fujiwara's power, the clan's authority began to experience a gradual decline in the following generations. During the time of Yorimichi and Michinaga, roughly 3/4 of the imperial court's kugyo, the absolute highest ranking level of aristocrats, who typically held the top positions in the central government, were made up of Fujiwara clan members. In contrast, less than half of the kugyo were made up of Fujiwara during the time of Yoshifusa and Mototsune, back in the late 800s, and this number would dip below half again by the beginning of the 1100s. As we discussed earlier, Chinese influence on Japanese culture began to wane after the abolition of the Kentoshi embassies in 894, and the unique culture that blossomed afterwards is referred to as Kokufū bunka, or Kokufū culture. The word Kokufū literally just means in the style of our country, and it typically denotes the culture of the 10th and 11th centuries. In other words, the culture that flourished during the time of the Fujiwara clan's Sekkan Seiji style of government. This period saw the rise of the unique Japanese style of visual artwork known as Yamato-e, a style of painting utilizing soft lines and vivid colors to depict natural landscapes or Japanese lifestyle and customs. Yamato-e is most famously represented in Heian Period emaki, aka picture scrolls, which also began to be created starting in this period. One of the most renowned examples of such is the Genji Monogatari emaki, the picture scroll illustrating Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji. This leads us nicely into another key cultural development under the umbrella of Kokufū bunka, the birth of uniquely Japanese styles of writing and literature. Prior to the mid-Heian period, the Japanese language, when put into written form, was expressed entirely through Chinese kanji characters, which were assigned to the various syllabic sounds of Japanese. The star pupils among you will recall that we discussed this writing style, called Manyō-gana, a few episodes ago. During the golden age of the Fujiwara, the Chinese characters used in Manyō-gana were broken down and simplified for ease of writing into an almost cursive-like style, and this simplification led to the birth of 2 of the Japanese alphabets that are still used to this very day, hiragana and katakana. The former, hiragana, was primarily developed and used by court women who employed it in letter writing or the exchange of poems. It is no coincidence that some of the most renowned writers of this period are also women, with the 2 foremost examples being the aforementioned Murasaki Shikibu and her contemporary Seisho Nagon. During this era, high-ranking aristocrats, mostly various members of the Fujiwara clan, were working vigorously to get their daughters married to the emperor, whether as his consort or as one of his lesser wives. When such a union occurred, the new imperial wife would move into the imperial palace to an area called the Kokufū, and she would be accompanied by numerous ladies-in-waiting from lower-ranking aristocratic families. This created an environment in which a large number of cultured and educated women were coexisting in close proximity to one another, and the result was a boom in literary culture. Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon were both ladies-in-waiting to two different wives of Emperor Ichijo around the turn of the 11th century. Their mistresses were both members of the Fujiwara clan, albeit from rival lines, and Shikibu and Shonagon were likewise drawn into this rivalry. Sei Shonagon was a woman well-versed in both the Japanese and Chinese classics, and her masterpiece, the Makura no Soshi, aka the Pillow Book, was a collection of essays detailing things such as the changing of the seasons or the day-to-day happenings in the imperial court. Murasaki Shikibu was also well-educated in classical Chinese literature, although she seems to have been a shyer person than Sei Shonagon, whom she criticized in her diary as being a frivolous show-off. Murasaki Shikibu authored the extremely famous Tale of Genji, or Genji Monogatari, a long-form novel depicting the romantic adventures and life story of its main character, an idealized aristocrat named Hikaru Genji. The work, which took Shikibu more than 10 years to complete, is often referred to as the world's first novel, and together with the aforementioned Makura no Soshi, it is still studied by Japanese school children today. In addition to Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon, there were a multitude of other women who excelled in the literary field around this time, and many of them expressed themselves through the diary format, known as Nikki in Japanese. Now, there are several different types of diaries that remain to us from the Heian period, including those written simply for recording one's daily job duties or events. But the literary category of diaries was written from the start with the intention of having the final product read and enjoyed by others. Some of the most famous of these include the Kagero Nikki, written by a Fujiwara woman known to us only as Fujiwara no Michitsuna's mother, and the Sarashina Nikki, which was written by Sugawara no Michizane's 5th-generation granddaughter, another woman whose real name is lost to history. Interestingly, however, one of the pioneering works in this literary diary category, and the one that may have provided the spark for the ones that followed, was written by a man, the aristocrat Kino Tsurayuki. Tsurayuki served a term as the governor of Tosa province in the early 930s, and he wrote his seminal work called the Tosa Nikki, or the Tosa Diary, as an account of his 55-day return journey from Tosa back to Heian-kyo at the end of his term. The unique thing about the Tosa Diary, however, is that Tsurayuki wrote the entire thing from the perspective of a woman, and penned it in hiragana rather than with the more masculine Chinese characters that men of the time were expected to use. By assuming a female persona, Tsurayuki was able to effectively free himself from the typical writing conventions of his era. In addition to the Tosa Diary, Tsurayuki was also responsible for compiling another monumental work of Heian literature, the Kokin Wakashu. This was a compilation of waka poetry written by several emperors and various nobles of the Heian court, and it was the first of its kind to be put together at the order of a sitting emperor, Emperor Daigo. Waka literally means Japanese poetry, and the word itself exists as a sort of antonym to kanshi, which is the word for traditional Chinese-style poetry. Prior to the era of Japanese history which we have focused on in this episode, kanshi was placed on a much higher pedestal than the native waka, which was seen as little more than an amusing pastime. Around the time of Emperor Uda and Emperor Daigo, this balance began to majorly shift. One's ability to skillfully compose waka poetry started to be seen as a measure of one's caliber as an aristocrat and a member of the imperial court, and the fact that the Kokin Wakashu was not only compiled by imperial order, but also contained numerous poems by particularly close confidants of Uda and Daigo is a clear indicator of this change. Beyond the world of painting and literature, Kokufū culture is also characterized by its defining developments in the architectural sphere. In particular, this was the era that birthed Shinden-zukuri, the style of architecture in which the homes of powerful Heian aristocrats were built. These homes were sprawling yashiki residences in which several different buildings were connected by columned corridors and looked out over a wide and lavish garden landscape. The main building of this residence, from which the architectural style derives its name, was known as the Shinden, literally sleeping building in Japanese. And it was here where the master of the house would sleep and hold banquets and events and such. To the north, east, and or west of the Shinden would be ancillary buildings called Tainoya, in which the master of the house's family members would reside. And these would be connected to the Shinden by hallways known as wataridono, which were sometimes completely unwalled. To the south of the Shinden would be a wide and expansive garden where anything from ceremonies to the playing of casual sports like kemari would take place. And in its center would be a large pond dotted with man-made islands connected by arching footbridges. A single wataridono hallway typically extended down into the heart of this garden to a wall-less building called the tsuridono, which faced out onto the garden's pond and provided a spot in which one could relax and enjoy the weather and the view. Judging from the beautiful artwork and lavish residences in which the aristocrats of the imperial court resided, one might almost think that the Heian period was a time of great optimism and lust for life, but this was not exactly the case. Japan has always been a country more susceptible than most to natural disaster, and Heian Japan was no exception, being ceaselessly ravaged by everything from earthquakes and volcanic eruptions to typhoons and droughts to famine and plague. The people of Heian Japan were very strongly aware of the fragility and transience of their own lives, and the anxiety resulting from this brought about the popularity from the mid-900s onward of an idea known as Mappo Shiso, end times thought. According to ancient Buddhist tradition, the world would pass through several eras following the death of Gautama Buddha, and the last of these was called Mappo, and it would be the era in which the world would descend into chaos and enlightenment would become impossible. Basically, it was the end times, although it didn't so much predict the end of the world as it did an impossibly long age of darkness and despair. Well, according to one ancient theory, this Mappo era would begin in the year 1052, and given the prevalence of death and natural disaster in Heian Japan, this theory built up a lot of steam, as it seemed to explain why life was so horrible for so many people. Thus, much like what happened in Europe in the Middle Ages, the people of ancient Japan began to look forward to the next life for peace and salvation, hoping that after death they would be reborn in what is basically the Buddhist equivalent of heaven, another world called Gokuraku Jodo, aka the Pure Land. The Pure Land was said to be a paradise completely free of pain and suffering, and it was the realm of the celestial Buddha Amitabha, known as Amidabutsu in Japanese. The Amida-do, or Hall of Amitabha, a hall of worship inside which a statue of Amitabha would be enshrined, became a common fixture of temple complexes in this era, and Fujiwara no Michinaga is even said to have had his deathbed moved into one of these halls so that he could gaze upon the image of Amitabha as he drew his final breaths. Michinaga's son, Yorimichi, the 50-year regent who we discussed a bit earlier in the video, created one of the most extravagant expressions of the new belief system with his construction of the Byōdōin Hō-do, known in English as the Byōdōin Phoenix Hall, on the grounds of what had been his vacation villa in 1053. The fact that 1053 is exactly 1 year after the year when the Heian Japanese believed that the world had entered into the end times is no coincidence, by the way. The Phoenix Hall is itself an Amida-do, or a hall of Amitabha, and it was built to be an expression of the appearance of the Pure Land, a literal heaven on earth, in other words. It is one of very few buildings from the Fujiwara age to have survived to the present day, and its depiction on the back of the modern 10-yen coin should give you an indication of just how well known and important it continues to be in Japan today. In addition to the construction of the iconic Phoenix Hall, the 1050s were also the decade which witnessed the outbreak of a conflict which would prove to be hugely influential in the history of the samurai, the former 9 Years' War. This, as well as its sequel conflict, if you will, the later 3 Years' War, are two incidents which I'm really looking forward to covering in our next episode, when we take a look at developments out in the provinces during the mid-Heian period. We will of course also be looking at some of the earlier proto-samurai conflicts, such as the rebellions of Taira no Masakado and Fujiwara no Sumitomo, and examining the changes in provincial governing style that led to the emergence of these armed warrior bands that would go on to become so iconic in Japanese history. If there's time, I'm also crossing my fingers that we can cover the Insei period, in which retired emperors began to take control of Japan's central government in the 11th and 12th centuries, but given how long-winded I've been in the last couple episodes, I once again can't make any promises. Anyway, there's a lot to cover, and I'm excited to share it with you all. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and
不運を祈るぞ。